Nobody saw this coming. LaMelo Ball did not just leave Charlotte. Charlotte made the kind of decision that tells the entire NBA something was happening behind closed doors that the public was never supposed to see. Because this was not supposed to be the ending. Not after the Hornets finally looked alive again. Not after the offense exploded. Not after the fan base finally had a reason to believe that Charlotte was becoming more than another forgotten team stuck in the middle of the standings. LaMelo was the face, the engine, the highlight machine, the player who made people watch Hornets basketball even when the wins were hard to find. And then suddenly, he was gone. Traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves in a move that shocked fans, split opinions, and raised one dangerous question. Did Charlotte just make the smartest decision of its future, or did they just give away the most talented player they have had in years? That is what makes this story so wild. The Hornets were not tearing everything down. They were not desperate. They were not coming off a hopeless season. They had momentum. They had young talent. They had a star guard who could bend defenses, throw impossible passes, hit deep threes, and turn one possession into a viral moment. So why move him now? That is where the story gets uncomfortable. Inside Charlotte, this was never only about basketball. It was about trust. It was about health. It was about maturity. It was about whether LaMelo Ball could truly be the player a franchise builds around for the next decade. And when the Hornets looked at the full picture, the injuries, the questions, the off-court noise, the pressure, and the future of Brandon Miller and their young core, they made a cold decision. They chose the future over the flash. But Minnesota saw something different. They saw a 4-year-old star with rare vision, elite creativity, and the perfect running mate for Anthony Edwards. They saw a chance to build one of the most explosive backcourts in the NBA. They saw danger, yes, but they also saw championship upside. So now the entire league is watching. If you are watching from Charlotte, Minnesota, Los Angeles, New York, or anywhere around the world, comment where you are watching from. If you think Charlotte made the right move, press 1-inch the comments. If you think they will regret trading LaMelo, press 2. And if you want more NBA stories like this, subscribe now, because this trade is only the beginning. The decision Charlotte had already made. The trade did not happen overnight. It only looked that way from the outside. Behind the scenes, Charlotte had been watching this situation for a long time. Every missed game, every medical update, every difficult conversation, every rumor that leaked into the NBA world. By the time LaMelo Ball's name hit the trade market publicly, the Hornets were not panicking. They were executing a decision they had already been preparing for. That is what made the move so cold. LaMelo wanted to stay, or at least that was the message coming from his side. But Charlotte was already listening. And once a franchise starts listening on its franchise player, the relationship changes forever. Even if nothing happens immediately, trust begins to crack. The player knows, the agent knows, other teams know, and suddenly the entire league can smell uncertainty. That is exactly what happened here. The Hornets had just watched their team take a real step forward. The offense was dangerous, the young core was exciting, the fan base finally had energy again. But inside the front office, the question was not just, can LaMelo help us win games? The real question was much heavier. Can LaMelo Ball be trusted as the centerpiece of the next era? That question changes everything. Because being the face of a franchise is not only about talent, it is about availability. It is about leadership. It is about consistency. It is about whether the organization can build a 5-year plan around you without feeling like everything could fall apart at any moment. And Charlotte was no longer sure. So when Minnesota called with a serious offer, the Hornets saw their escape route. Naz Reid gave them size. The picks gave them flexibility. The swaps gave them future upside. Most importantly, the trade gave them control again. They were no longer waiting on LaMelo's health. They were no longer waiting on his maturity. They were no longer waiting for the next question to become the next crisis. Charlotte did not trade LaMelo because he lacked star power. They traded him because they were afraid his star power came with a price they could no longer afford. And that fear started with the one file no front office could ignore. The injury file nobody could ignore. For years, LaMelo Ball's talent made people dream. But his injury history made Charlotte hesitate. That was the battle inside the Hornets organization. On one side, they saw a rare offensive genius, a guard with deep range, elite passing, fearless creativity, and the kind of flair that can turn a small market team into must-watch television. On the other side, they saw the medical reports, the missed games, the setbacks, the constant need to manage his body like every season could become fragile again. That is a terrifying way to build a franchise. LaMelo's ankle issues became more than a temporary problem. They became part of his story. Every time he looked ready to explode, something slowed him down. Every time Charlotte fans started believing the worst was over, another update appeared. Out, questionable, limited minutes, recovery plan. Maintenance. Those words wear down a franchise. And when a player is on a major contract, those words become even heavier. Because the front office is not only asking what he can do when he plays, they are asking how often he can actually be there when the season matters most. That is the uncomfortable truth. When LaMelo is healthy, Charlotte's offense looks completely different. He sees passes before they exist. He stretches defenses from almost impossible distances. He creates rhythm for teammates who cannot create the same looks by themselves. He gives a team confidence, pace, and identity. But when he is unavailable, everything changes. The Hornets had lived through that cycle too many times. LaMelo returns. LaMelo shines. LaMelo reminds everyone why he was supposed to be the future. Then the concern comes back. Another ankle, another soreness report, another plan to protect him. Eventually, potential is not enough. Charlotte had to ask the question nobody wanted to say out loud. What if the healthiest version of LaMelo Ball is the exception, not the rule? That question may have decided everything. Because if the Hornets believed his value was at its highest after a healthier season, then waiting longer was not patience, it was risk. One more setback could damage his trade value. One more long absence could make the market colder. One more year of uncertainty could trap Charlotte in a future they no longer fully believed in. So they moved before the next problem arrived, and the injury file was only the beginning. The noise away from basketball. The injuries explained part of Charlotte's fear, but they did not explain all of it. Because with LaMelo Ball, the conversation was never only about what happened on the court, it was also about what followed him away from it. The headlines, the viral clips, the concerns about judgment. The feeling that the face of the franchise was becoming too difficult to separate from distraction. That is where things became even more uncomfortable. Reports and public discussion around LaMelo's driving habits had already become part of his image in Charlotte. Videos circulated, stories spread, fans talked, local attention grew. And whether every story was fair or not, the bigger issue for the Hornets was simple. This was not the kind of attention they wanted around their franchise player. When you are the face of an NBA team, your decisions do not only belong to you anymore, they reflect on the organization. Every headline becomes a team issue. Every controversy becomes a question for the front office. Every distraction follows the coach into the next press conference and the players into the locker room. That wears people down. Charlotte needed LaMelo to be the stable center of the project. Instead, there were moments when he became the center of noise. And for a young team trying to build something serious, noise can be dangerous. That does not erase his talent. It does not erase what he gave the fan base. It does not erase the magic he brought to the court. But it does change the way a front office measures risk. The Hornets were not just evaluating a player. They were evaluating the total package. Can he stay healthy? Can he lead? Can he avoid distractions? Can he be the standard for younger players? Can Brandon Miller and the rest of the roster look at him as the person setting the tone? Those questions mattered, and once Charlotte started answering them with doubt, the trade became easier to understand. Not easy, not painless, but understandable, because a franchise player is supposed to calm the room. He is supposed to make the future feel stronger. He is supposed to be the person the organization trusts when pressure rises. Charlotte looked at LaMelo and saw brilliance, but they also saw uncertainty. And while fans were still watching the highlights, the Hornets were already watching the future shift towards someone else. Why Charlotte chose a new core? The biggest clue in this entire trade is not what Charlotte gave up. It is what Charlotte believes it already has. Because the Hornets did not move LaMelo Ball into an empty future. They moved him because they had started believing in a different one. Brandon Miller, Con Knuppel, Naz Reid, Kobe White, draft picks, flexibility, a roster that may not be as flashy, but might be more stable, more balanced, and easier to build around. That is the gamble. LaMelo was the star attraction. He was the player who made the highlights. But Charlotte started to see something in Miller and Knuppel that changed the conversation. Miller brings size, scoring, and two-way potential. Knuppel brings shooting, movement, and the kind of efficient offensive game that fits next to almost anyone. Together, they gave Charlotte a new vision. Maybe the Hornets no longer needed one unpredictable engine controlling everything. Maybe they needed a cleaner structure, more balance, more physicality, more players who could grow together without the entire team depending on one fragile star. That is where Naz Reid mattered. Reid is not LaMelo. He does not bring the same electricity. He does not sell the same jerseys. He does not make fans jump out of their seats with one pass, but he brings size, shooting, toughness, and a different shape to the roster. He gives Charlotte something they lacked, a front court piece who can stretch the floor and add physical presence. Then come the picks. Those future assets are not just numbers on a trade chart. They are options. They are doors. They are future trade chips. They give Charlotte the ability to chase another star, move up in a draft, or reshape the roster again if the Milo Newpol timeline accelerates. That is what Jeff Peterson bought. Not certainty, flexibility, and in today's NBA, flexibility is power. Still, this decision comes with enormous pressure. Because if LaMelo becomes a superstar in Minnesota, Charlotte will hear about it forever. Every deep three, every no-look pass, every playoff moment, every highlight next to Anthony Edwards will become a reminder of what the Hornets gave away. But Charlotte made its choice. They chose structure over spectacle. They chose balance over chaos. They chose a future they could control over a star they no longer fully trusted. Now Minnesota has to live with the other side of that bet. Minnesota's dangerous gamble. Minnesota did not trade for LaMelo Ball because it wanted a safe move. Minnesota traded for him because safe was no longer enough. The Timberwolves had already reached a point where being good did not solve the problem. They had Anthony Edwards, they had playoff experience, they had defensive identity, they had already felt what it was like to be close. But close is not the same as championship level. And in a Western Conference loaded with size, speed, and young superstars, Minnesota needed something bigger. So they swung hard. LaMelo Ball next to Anthony Edwards is one of the most fascinating pairings in basketball. On paper, it looks explosive. Edwards is power, force, pressure, and fearlessness. LaMelo is vision, pace, creativity, and chaos. One attacks the defense like a storm. The other bends it like a magician. That combination could be terrifying. For the first time in his NBA career, LaMelo may not have to be the number one personality, number one scorer, number one creator, and number one answer all at once. In Minnesota, Anthony Edwards is the alpha that could free LaMelo to become the best version of himself. A creative playmaker who can score when needed, push tempo, create easy looks, and punish defenses that overreact to Edwards. But the risk is just as real. Will LaMelo accept that role? Will he defend consistently? Will his body hold up? Will the Timberwolves survive the loss of front court depth? Can a team built around two high-usage guards beat the biggest, strongest teams in the West? Nobody knows, and that is what makes the trade so dangerous. Minnesota did not just add talent, it added volatility. LaMelo brings a higher ceiling, but also a wider range of outcomes. If everything works, the Wolves may have one of the most exciting offenses in the league. If it fails, they may have sacrificed balance, depth, and future assets for a player Charlotte had already decided was too risky. That is the brutal part. The same reasons Charlotte moved him are the same reasons Minnesota may regret him. But the same reasons fans still believe in him are the reasons Minnesota had to try. Because players like LaMelo do not become available often. And when they do, every serious front office asks itself one question. Can our structure unlock what his old team could not? For Minnesota, the answer had to be yes. Now they have to prove it. Can LaMelo finally become that guy? This is the part of the story that could change everything for LaMelo Ball. Charlotte asked him to be the face of the franchise before the franchise was truly ready to win. He carried the attention, the hope, the criticism, the losing, the injuries, and the pressure of being the player everyone blamed when things went wrong. That is a heavy burden for any young star. In Minnesota, the burden changes. LaMelo is no longer walking into a team that needs him to create its entire identity. The Timberwolves already have one. Anthony Edwards gives them attitude. Rudy Gobert gives them defense. Jaden McDaniels gives them length. The organization has playoff scars. The fan base has expectations. This is not a young team begging for relevance. This is a team trying to break through. That could be exactly what LaMelo needs. Sometimes a player does not fail because he lacks talent. Sometimes he struggles because he is placed in the wrong role at the wrong time. In Charlotte, LaMelo had to be the show. In Minnesota, he can be the weapon. He can attack tilted defenses. He can throw passes to a superstar who finishes with force. He can play faster, freer, and with less pressure to prove he is the entire solution. But this chapter will not be written by talent alone. It will be written by discipline. LaMelo has to defend better. He has to take care of his body. He has to manage the noise. He has to understand that championship basketball is not built only on highlights. It is built on habits. It is built on the boring possessions, the extra rotations, the smart shot selection, the willingness to let someone else close the game when that is what winning requires. That is the real test, because LaMelo Ball has already proven he can be special. He has not yet proven he can be dependable when the stakes are highest. Minnesota is betting that Anthony Edwards can help bring that out of him. Not by controlling him, but by giving him a new kind of environment. One where LaMelo does not have to carry everything. One where his creativity becomes a weapon instead of a burden. One where his flaws can be protected and his strengths can explode. And if that happens, Charlotte's decision could age badly, very badly, because a locked-in LaMelo Ball with something to prove is not just dangerous. He might be exactly the kind of player the West was not ready for. Who really won the trade? The hardest part about this trade is that both teams can convince themselves they won. Charlotte can say it made the responsible decision. The Hornets moved a risky star before his value dropped. They added Naz Reid. They collected future picks and swaps. They created flexibility. They cleared the way for Brandon Miller and Con Knuppel to become the new foundation. From a front office perspective, that is not reckless. It is strategic. Minnesota can say it got the best player in the deal. And in the NBA, that usually matters most. LaMelo Ball is 24. He is an elite passer. He can shoot from deep. He can transform an offense instantly. Pairing him with Anthony Edwards gives the Timberwolves the kind of star power that can scare any defense in the league. That is not reckless either. It is ambitious. So, who won? The answer depends on what you believe about LaMelo. If you believe his injuries are behind him, Minnesota won. If you believe the off-court concerns will fade in a new environment, Minnesota won. If you believe playing next to Edwards will unlock a more mature, focused, efficient version of LaMelo, then the Timberwolves may have just built one of the most exciting guard duos of this generation. But if you believe Charlotte knew something deeper, then the Hornets won. If LaMelo misses major time again, Charlotte won. If the fit with Edwards becomes awkward, Charlotte won. If Minnesota's front court weakness cost them in the playoffs, Charlotte won. If the picks and swaps become valuable, Charlotte may look like the smartest team in the room. That is why this trade is so fascinating. It is not a simple winner and loser deal. It is a bet on information. Charlotte bet on what it knew from years inside the building. Minnesota bet on what it believes it can change. And LaMelo is trapped in the middle of both arguments. To one team, he became too risky. To the other, he became too talented to ignore. That is a powerful place to be, because now every game becomes evidence. Every big performance will make Charlotte look foolish. Every injury update will make Minnesota look reckless. Every playoff win will rewrite the story. Every bad loss will reopen the debate. This trade will not be judged in one summer. It will be judged in scars, wins, regrets, and banner. The three possible futures. There are three ways this story can end, and every one of them changes how the NBA remembers this trade. The first ending is the dream scenario for Minnesota. LaMelo stays healthy, Anthony Edwards embraces the partnership, the backcourt becomes electric, the offense jumps to another level, LaMelo creates easy looks, Edwards dominates late games, and the Timberwolves become a real championship threat. If that happens, Charlotte will never escape the criticism. People will say the Hornets gave up too soon. They will say a small market team finally had a superstar and got scared. They will say Charlotte confused risk with failure and traded away the exact player who could have made them matter. That is the nightmare for Hornets fans. The second ending is the nightmare for Minnesota. LaMelo's body does not hold up. The defense becomes a problem. The fit with Edwards feels unnatural. The front court depth looks too thin. The Wolves win games, but not enough of the right game. Then the playoffs arrive, and the same questions that followed LaMelo in Charlotte follow him again. If that happens, Minnesota will look desperate. They will have traded flexibility for flash, balance for buzz, depth for a star whose old team already saw the warning signs. And if Anthony Edwards ever grows frustrated with the direction of the franchise, this trade will become the move people point to first. That is the danger. The third ending is the most complicated one. Both teams survive. LaMelo becomes good in Minnesota, but not great enough to win a title. Charlotte becomes better balanced, but not explosive enough to scare the East. Both organizations defend their decision. Both fan bases argue online. Both sides can point to evidence. Nobody fully wins. Nobody fully loses. That may actually be the most realistic ending, because NBA trades are rarely clean. They are messy, they are emotional, they are shaped by health, timing, contracts, pressure, and luck. A move can be smart and still fail. A move can be reckless and still work. That is what makes this league so unforgiving. But LaMelo controls more of this story than anyone else. If he matures, stays available, competes defensively, and accepts the challenge next to Edwards, he can change the entire conversation. He can turn Charlotte's doubt into fuel. He can prove that the problem was not him, but the situation around him. But if the same concerns return, Charlotte's decision will look less like betrayal and more like foresight. That is the line LaMelo is walking now. One direction leads to redemption, the other leads to confirmation, and the whole NBA is waiting to see which version shows up. The real lesson behind the trade, the real lesson of the LaMelo Ball trade, is not that Charlotte was right or Minnesota was wrong. The real lesson is that talent is never the whole story. In the NBA, talent gets you drafted. Talent gets you paid. Talent fills arenas, sells jerseys, creates highlights, and makes fans believe. But talent alone does not build a championship organization. At some point, every franchise has to ask harder questions. Can this player lead? Can he stay available? Can he grow through criticism? Can he make the people around him better? Can he handle responsibility when the spotlight stops being fun and starts becoming heavy? That is where Charlotte reached its breaking point. The Hornets did not stop believing LaMelo Ball was gifted. They stopped believing the total picture was safe enough to build around. That is a painful distinction, but an important one. Sometimes a player can be incredible and still not be the right cornerstone for a franchise's future. For Minnesota, the lesson is different. Great teams do not become champions by avoiding risk forever. Sometimes they have to gamble. Sometimes they have to take a player another organization no longer trusts and believe their culture can unlock him. That is what the Timberwolves are doing. They are betting on talent, motivation, and a new environment. But LaMelo has the biggest lesson of all. This is his chance to rewrite the narrative. Not with words, not with social media, not with one great game in November, but with habits, with availability, with professionalism, with defensive effort, with the kind of maturity that turns a gifted player into a winning player. Because peace in a career does not come from proving every critic wrong in one night. It comes from becoming steady enough that the criticism slowly loses power. That is the human side of this. LaMelo does not need to be perfect. He needs to be responsible. Charlotte does not need to hate him to move on. Minnesota does not need to ignore the risks to believe in him. Fans do not need to turn every trade into a war. Sometimes basketball is simply about timing, fit, growth, and hard choices. Now the story belongs to the court. If you believe Charlotte made the right decision, comment 1. If you believe Minnesota stole a future superstar, comment 2. If you think LaMelo will become better next to Anthony Edwards, comment 3. And if you want more deep NBA stories like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with another real basketball fan.